Excellent. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Dr. Esther Schmidt. I'm the director of the Center for Historic Houses at OP Jindal Global University. I'm very excited about today's event. I always like to make the event very interactive, so I'd like to encourage you to please share information with us, or comments, or any questions. You can use the chat box for this. And I know we have a very international audience. I'm really pleased to hear this. We have a number of curators from the UK and the United States. And this is really wonderful that we've been able to achieve this community of people who have an interest in the historic houses of India. I'm also very pleased to share that so far the lecture series has really had a great benefit to the participating palaces. So they've been featured in the press, people have visited the palaces, and research has been initiated. This is exactly what we were hoping to achieve. Today we have a very new topic, and I must say, so far this is number 14, I think, and every single property has a unique history. Today we have, I always like to have a general theme. The theme is today are several. One is a hill station and having a historic property in a hill station, but we also have a very, very unique family history and a particularly love for French culture and decorative arts and design. And I'd like to put this into context with a short introduction. Let me just share the screen with you. So. And one thing I wanted to mention, of course, we do have the challenge with historic houses that sometimes the Wi-Fi connection can be a problem. So please bear with us. I think it's fantastic that we are able to travel all over India, really from east to west to south, and that we are able to explore these fantastic properties. And we are very grateful for everyone to make the time. So I have a number of themes that I would like to introduce, and then our speakers, they have much, much more knowledge about the topic as far as their property and family is concerned. So I hope to raise them. So one theme that I'd like to discuss is the idea of cosmopolitanism and travel. Travel leading to learning, to pleasure, but also to a specific taste culture. I'd like to discuss connoisseurship and patronage. I'd like to look at the history of interiors, particularly the ephemeral or the temporary, because we are looking at both objects that have been accumulated through travel on various trips in distant corners of the earth, and also the whole idea of a hill station is, of course, a temporary abode. How does that impact the lifestyle? How does it impact the interiors? So looking at the Château Kapurthala, I'd like to raise the question of hill stations. And last week, for instance, we looked at lake palaces, which is also a particular type of typology associated with pleasure. Usually when we talk about hill stations, we hear a lot about the British and hill stations. The idea that Indians also lived in hill stations, and the whole topic of Maharajas and royal families in hill stations is something that is worth looking at and studying it in more detail. So these are the kind of overall topics I would like to bear in mind and focus on. As always, I have a few surprises, and I like to connect the history of India with global history and developments in the decorative arts, in design and interior architecture. So what we see here is the Hotel Imperial, which was one of the finest hotels in Vienna with the Hotel Sacher. And you also see a lovely kind of luggage label from the hotel. And this is a room, this is unfortunately the only room, the only photograph I could find from 1958. But I've chosen this because if you look at the picture, there's a lot to say, because there is a lot of French influence, and you can see where I'm going with this, because the family of Kapurthala is very closely associated with France and French decorative arts and design. So the French style was very popular in the early 20th century, and I'll come to this in more detail. It's also specifically associated with bedrooms, and particularly with female bedrooms. Many Viennese palaces, for example, palais, had 2 bedrooms, one for the husband and one for the lady of the house. And the style and the interiors were usually different. So the kind of French style, like Louis XV or Louis VI style, was preferred for women. And you see it here, it was also painted, usually in a white color. And we come back to the meaning and the significance of this in a minute. And now imagine, it's 1893, and there's a beautiful young girl, the young wife of the Maharaja of Kapurthala, and she is going to Europe for the first time, and she is not allowed to come along to any events, not then, and people are not allowed to come to her, but various instructors and teachers were allowed to come. So wherever she was, she had piano lessons and she had dancing lessons to learn the local dances. And before the dancing instructor came in, she was a little bit naughty. And she was actually singing this song.
A smart and stylish girl you see, belle of good society, not too strict, but rather free, yet as right and right can be, never forward, never bold, not too hot and not too cold, just the very thing I'm told that in your arms you'd like to hold. And join me, tarara-boom-dee, 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 tarara-boom-dee.
And this alone was enough to be reported in the press. And of course, wherever the Maharaja of Kapurthala went, it was widely reported in the press, and he was very well traveled. And so this is what we know, because I found this particular article, and this particular song was a song from the kind of music halls. It was popular in the 1890s. Probably, it's not quite clear where the song originally comes from, probably from the US, but it was popularized in dance halls in the UK. And interestingly enough, the title of this particular song, and it was usually associated with dancing a funny dance like a con-con and so on. It was a kind of shocking thing to do for a young girl from a good house, but she had a good sense of humor. Interestingly enough, this song was used by Gilbert and Sullivan, and it was premiered in the same month that the Maharaja of Kapurthala was in Vienna, just a few weeks earlier. So really, this young girl was very modern in a way. She really knew what was happening, and she was singing this and playing on the piano. And so this is one of the most expensive, actually, productions ever made. It was performed at the Savoy Theatre in London. And you can see that the tarara from the song was actually used for one of the figures. And interestingly enough, this Utopia Limited was a parody and a satire about the British Raj, and actually quite, quite challenging. And it was this idea that a king, wanted to change and rattle this kind of lifestyle in Utopia, and he wanted everyone to adopt English customs, and he wanted everyone to be an English limited company. This was a kind of joke about it. And of course, the English Limited Company has to do with the English Companies Act of 1862. But we know from the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century already that such a similar model had been adopted and led to the fact that the Netherlands were the richest country in the world in the 17th century. So this is a satire. So you can see from the kind of harmless joy of the Maharani dancing and playing the piano in the Hotel Imperial in Vienna to the very political, satirical operetta of Gilbert and Sullivan. So this is the article that I found in the press in Vienna, in the Salonblatt. This was the kind of newspaper where you would hear about royalty from all over the world, who was summering where and who was doing what, and what to wear and where to go. And the Viennese had interviewed the Maharaja of Kapurthala, who was only 21. And so they knew exactly what he liked, what he enjoyed. They described him as someone very curious, very knowledgeable. And he went to the opera house. You see this in the middle, that's the state opera. And of course, it was the modern Vienna, you know, with the new Ringstraße, the big boulevard. This was the development typical of cities in the late 19th century in Europe, where the city walls had been erased and made you know, room for a big boulevard. And also he went to the horse races in Freudenau, and he even went to the Burgtheater. So this must have been probably difficult for him in German, but I know that he was very good with languages and spoke French and so on. Maybe he even spoke some German. And I also heard that he sent 2 of his sons to the Theresianum Academy, which was a you know, very famous school in Vienna and usually reserved for the aristocracy. So there is a connection between Austria and Kapurthala. And of course, the press reported about his wonderful journeys. And we'll hear much more about this from Cynthia, because he really went all over the world. We also know from these accounts that he liked to shop and buy beautiful things. And apparently he really cared very, very much. He had a very sophisticated taste. And he would go to the most famous places, such as Meyers and Söhne. We know that he went to this shop, and I don't know what he bought. Maybe we can do some more research. Maybe you have some of these items. But I've given you an example of the type of things he could have bought. You know, maybe a travel set made out of silver. They also had medals. And here you can see someone looking at the shop window of this very, very famous shop. Or silverware. And you also have the silver mark. So Cynthia, if you find this kind of silver mark, VMS, maybe we can do some further research. That would be great. And of course, you know, the best was only, you know, good enough. And so, you know, this was a particular court jeweler who also had exhibited at the, 1873, I'm sorry, that was a typo, at the publication is from 1875, but the World Exhibition of Vienna is 1873, it is correct. And so we really see how mobile objects were, how globalized the world has become, and how many, many more people could participate in the consumption and in the knowledge of objects from all over the world. He'd been to the World Exhibition in Paris as well, and this is an image of the exhibition in Vienna. So I told you already about the preference of French style for luxury hotels. So this is something he would have known very well because he traveled all over the world. So this is surely something that must have influenced him. We also know of a number of other people, such as the Rothschilds, Waddesdon Manor, but also their castle in Reichenau an der Rax in Austria. These were built in the French style. So they had a personal preference for French decorative arts. They had a wonderful collection of 18th century furniture, also some that used to belong to Marie Antoinette and Reynolds, and a fantastic collection. In India, it is a little bit different because the climate is very challenging. So we know of examples where even the imported antiques for Rashtrapati Bhavan, the vice-regal palace in Delhi, and it actually got destroyed because of the high humidity and, you know, the extreme heat. So what you also see, and we're talking about the same time, 1897 was the publication of the Decoration of Houses by Edith Wharton. And maybe not many people know that before she became the famous novelist, this was actually her first book, co-authored with Ogden Codman. And already in the book, there was a strong influence of French style and furniture and interiors. And this is a really interesting and exciting movement, because this is the rise of professionalization in interior design, propagated particularly by women. And if you can see this, I showed you, this is a photograph of her house, the Mount, built in 1902 in the United States. And it didn't exactly look like that, because I think Henrietta Spencer Churchill, she's done some interior design, so the curtains maybe look different, but the boiserie and the furniture is original. And you can see that there is a lot of influence of French furniture design. And this was basically a response, I feel, to what you see below. And this is the kind of nightmare of design in the late 19th century, the cluttered Victorian interior. And so this was actually very modern, but not modernism. So my theory is that the rise of professionalization of interior design, where women were kind of, the leaders in the field, is an alternative to modernism. And this continues. So we have, Edith Wharton, she loved design. She wrote about design, but she didn't work as a practicing interior designer. When we talk about a professional, we talk about, someone who gets a salary, who gets payment. And this, most people regard Elsie de Wolfe as one of the first practicing interior designers. And again, you can see the influence of French design, not only in the furniture, but she used the treillage, the trellis design from gardens, and she brought the garden into the house. And of course, bringing the garden into the house is a very old design feature, which you even see in Mughal palace as well. Some of Nur Jahan's design, she is also someone known for fashion design and also in interior design. She also often used cypresses, and of course in the Mughal tradition, the garden as paradise is something that you will see. And this is a continuous tradition that goes on also with Nancy Lancaster and John Fowler. You see a lit à la Polonais, although it's actually not in the parallel way, so she kind of changes it a little bit. And it's this kind of invention of the English country house style with John Fowler and Nancy Lancaster, the American and the British designer together, really inventing this mixing of patterns and mixing of different types of furniture from different eras and from different regions. So I feel all of this, and again, you see this also, that industrialists in the United States in the Gilded Age also have this preference for French design. So we really see this. So basically in luxury hotels, the rise of women designers with the impact on French design, and the impact of French design leading towards the English country house style. And somehow the Maharajas seem to have kind of intuitively also responded to this. And this brings me to the next topic, namely hill stations, where we'll hear more about it. So of course, we have different numbers. It depends how you actually assess hill station. It's primarily a phenomenon of the 19th century, particularly the late 19th century, although we have earlier hill stations in the 1820s and 30s. Particularly Shimla, Mussoorie. Here, this is a Chail Palace, also by a Maharaja, the Maharaja of Patiala. And there are different reasons for using a hill station. There could be one type of hill station like Shimla, which was really a center of power and also a rule, but it could also be for health benefits or like a sanatorium, and it could be more private. So this is one of the best buildings in one of the hill stations. And this is, of course, the former Viceregal Lodge in Shimla, built between 1880 and 1888. And I wanted to show this, so to give you a context for what we are going to hear in a minute, when Château Kapurthala was built. So you really see, looks almost like an Oxford college, lots of wood paneling inside. And there are, unfortunately, I don't have so many pictures of the interiors. This is, one example of a ballroom and a small drawing room. And there was this kind of anecdote where Lady Reading was listening to the band, and she asked the aide-de-camp what was actually that particular song, and he was yelling loud, "The memory of your kisses," but the music stopped in that moment, and everyone heard what she said, and I actually traced this song as well, and it's this.
You and I said goodbye, but you loved me for a while. Night and day with me will stay the memory of your smile. Oh, you are not near stay, and then we had to fly to you.
So this is just to give you a little taste. And interestingly, I think the history is really much more complex that we use it and that we talk about it, and this kind of dichotomy between the British and the rule and the domination. For instance, in this case, Lady Reading was actually Jewish, and she married the viceroy who was also Jewish. And I don't know whether people have actually written about this, a Jewish viceroy. I mean, that's just kind of really unusual history. So, you know, being part of a minority and then being kind of the ruler, you know, of India as well is a very interesting story that that is worth actually doing research on. And finally, we come to, Kapurthala, the palace in Kapurthala, and also the Château in Mussoorie. And before we come now and I lead over, I'll have one more historical footage from the coronation of the Maharaja of Kapurthala.
At the age of 5, the Maharaja Sukhjit Singh came to the throne of his northwest Indian province in the heart of the Punjab. For 60 years, he has ruled it wisely and well. Cooperating with the British government, he has modernized almost everything except its royal transport. He has built schools and colleges and hospitals. Today, the Maharaja, in a lounge suit and flowing turban, inspects his guard of honor as his people pay tribute to their ruler. From every corner of the state, they bring him gifts. They make obeisance before the Maharaja and his 4-year-old grandson. They weigh him with pieces of solid gold, which afterwards are distributed to the poor. And days of feasting end with a durbar and state procession, with the Indian sun shining down on gently swaying elephants and glittering gold, on the majestic pageantry of India.
Thank you. I'll now hand over to Cynthia, but first of all, we have the introduction by His Highness. Thank you so much for being here and for taking the time. I'll stop screen share so that we, hold on.
All right, so I'll share my screen now, and I'll share mine, and he is going to give a little bit of some background on his grandfather. Of course, to really talk about his grandfather, we would keep you here hours. There's so much to tell. He was such a remarkable and interesting person. But he's just going to share a little bit of background before I get to the chateau. So let me share my screen. Hopefully we'll be okay here. What happened? Okay. Whoop. What's this? How do I get rid of this? Okay. All right then. So here we go. Why don't you?
Good evening, Dr. Smith, and a very good evening to all our viewers. And I thank you for being with us this evening. I won't take much of your time, but my name is Sukhjit, and I'm the grandson of the great Maharaja Sukhjit Singh. I knew him from very close quarters, and I'd be happy to share my recollections with you. The point that I'm going to try and make first and foremost, so that Cynthia can take on thereafter, is this fascination with France. Why should an Indian potentate who is well versed in his own classics, because he was well versed in Sanskrit, he was familiar with Persian, well versed in Urdu, and he was very good with his English, because he was under an exceptional tutor, Mr. Wood, who saw that his pupil had a flair for languages, and he encouraged the young Raja, who, as he was then, to learn as many languages as possible. So knowing his own classical languages, the ruler would be expected to, when he ascended the throne, would be expected to be coached in the traditions and in the culture and aesthetics of his own country. But I would like to suggest to you as a line of thought that here he was familiar with what he was being taught in a manner of speaking, but he found that the Indian aesthetics, or the aesthetics in his country, were mainly rooted in the spiritual medium. His intense thirst for knowledge, absolutely insatiable thirst for knowledge and logic and scientific reasoning, because of his tutored education through Mr. Wood, wanted his fertile mind to look into something where human beings or humanity creating something in its own image to be able to, in a way, balance out the spiritual aesthetics. It was in 1893 when he first went to France, and he saw the progress abroad, scientific and otherwise, and material, that he was absolutely captivated and fascinated. It was here that he realized that all the senses came into play, and the tactile, the audio, the auditory, and the olfactory, they all came into play. And human beings were devising all manner of aesthetics to please the senses, to develop the senses, and to bring in refinement which would keep everybody enthralled. This is what fascinated him. And it's from that that he started his remarkable career in developing his own taste in aesthetics, possibly exemplified by the palace in Kapurthala, commenced in 1900 and more or less completed in 1908, though it was first habited in 1906. Thereafter, he commissioned the Château in 1896, completed in 1899, and the picture that you see in front of you is the other Renaissance period Italianate style building that he commissioned, the villa in 1894, completed in 1896. So his buildings were quite remarkable and reflected his aesthetic interest in architecture. But to me, his pièce de résistance was actually the Moorish mosque that he built in 1926 and completed in 1930. It's a little piece of Morocco transferred to the plains of the Punjab. And it is here that this exemplifies and illustrates his secular outlook on life, because secularism is not merely semantics, but one has to live it and believe in it. And now I will ask Cynthia to take over. Yeah, this is the foundation stone of the mosque. And if you read the inscription, you will see how his secular bent of mind was manifested, not only in his thinking, but in his actual living and the way he exemplified it.
Well, we've seen some wonderful examples of the architectural legacy of Maharaja Jagjit Singh. And it's obvious that he looked outside of India for inspiration derived from his travels. So now we're going to turn to the Château Kapurthala.
Let's make it bigger, please, to a slideshow. If you could go to slideshow.
Slideshow. What can I do? Is that better?
Yes, that's good. Great. Thank you.
All right, then. So we've seen how diverse his tastes were between Italy, Morocco, and of course, France. And the Château Kapurthala was the Maharaja's summer home in Mussoorie for about 50 years. And it's one of the very rare, unique examples of the French Renaissance revival architecture in Italy. And I'm going to walk you through the exterior and the interior of the chateau. And as I do so, do bear in mind that the Maharaja was very actively involved in all of the aspects of this building, from the architecture to the design and to the decor and the gardens. Now, Mussoorie remains a very popular hill station in India. And before I go on about the Château, I thought I'd just spend a moment talking about what is a hill station, because I realize some of our audience is joining from outside of India, and they may not know what the concept or word means. Hill stations were enclaves largely established by the British. They were high above sea level in the hills, so they were cool, and they offered a refuge from the hot, searing Indian summers. Now, one of the best known hill station is Shimla, or Simla as it used to be called. And the British would move every year, the British administration, from their summer capital, which was then Calcutta until 1931. And for 6 months of the year, they'd move everyone up to Mussoorie, which my larger star is up above. While we have this map, we can see where Kapurthala is, and then we can see just a smaller star, that's Mussoorie. And these hill stations were scattered about India. Down south is Ooty, that's where I spent my summer, where my family has a home in the hills there. And they were, again, very popular. The British would come there and they would recreate their homeland, because you had that misty weather like Scotland and pines of England. So you would find churches, clubs, and the social recreation that was native. So these hill stations very much had a European feeling to them. Now, Shimla was the summer capital, and Maharaja Jagjit Singh also wanted to spend his summers away from the heat of Punjab. And he had spent time visiting Kashmir state, visiting some of the other hill stations such as Dharamsala and Dalhousie. But he went to Shimla and really enjoyed the gaiety there and how European and vibrant it was. But he found that the Viceroy and the administration, they were really keeping their eyes out on him, keeping tabs on him and his fellow brother princes, making sure that they were proper and pukka. So he didn't feel he could really quite relax there, even though he found Simla so attractive. Whereas Mussoorie, he went in 1892 for the first time and discovered it was just the best. It had the best of both worlds. You had the hill stations, the environment, you had the beautiful views, the hills, the cool air. You had that wonderful festive atmosphere as a resort, but without this restrictedness. So immediately he wrote in his diaries, he was looking out for a house or a piece of property in Mussoorie. And below in this image, well, on top, we saw the Viceregal Lodge in Simla, but below we see the main library square in Mussoorie on this postcard. And there's a band playing. There is this bandstand, which actually the Maharaja had donated. And it still stands, altered, but it's still extant. And this was one of the elements of Mussoorie he really enjoyed, that promenading on the square and listening to the music. So he was absolutely determined that he was going to set his summer roots down in Mussoorie. Now, in the interim, he had made his first life-changing voyage to Europe and America. And from there, he had gleaned so much as far as architecture and art and objects, and he was already thinking about how he was going to infuse what he liked into this new home, the Château Kapurthala. But it wasn't until 1895 that he found available the St. Helens estate. And this was a sprawling estate which consisted of this large bungalow. And this is a typical bungalow you find in India, you find in the plains, you find in the hills. But the advantage of this property, it came with 22 acres, lovely views, and additional cottages to house his growing family. Now, it wasn't easy for an Indian prince to just buy in British India. Now, he may have been the ruler of Kapurthala state, but outside of that, and Mussoorie was under the United Provinces jurisdiction, he was subject to British law. He couldn't just buy without going through formalities. He actually had to obtain permission from the Viceroy to purchase this property. So he made a trip to Shimla, called on Viceroy Elgin, and was able to convince him that he was going to be able to afford the property and also going to maintain it. And no sooner than the deed had transferred, he turned his sight to a vast hillside parcel above the St. Helens house, and immediately in 1896 laid the foundation stone for the Château Kapurthala. And it's actually his little 5-year-old son and heir, Tikaraja Paramjit Singh, who's standing on a chair with the architects and the European guests, who's doing the honors. And here's the foundation stone today. And I'm going to point out something. The J.O.S. Elmore was the state engineer of Kapurthala. He also designed the Villa Bonavista and many other civic buildings. You found that within these princely states, the state engineer would take on the role as an architect. We saw that at Nilambag Palace, for example, recently in that lecture. It's rather notable that Robert Fellow Chisholm, who was a very prominent architect in British India, served as the consulting architect. Chisholm worked extensively in Madras, mostly in Indo-Saracenic style, but he also consulted on this building, worked closely with the Maharaja, and very notably, he worked on the Lakshmi Vilas Palace in Baroda. So it's rather prestigious to have that commonality with Chisholm. Now we saw how St. Helens looked. It was a bungalow style, and we found that prevalent in the hills. In addition, you found these Victorian Gothic cottages, and we can see the Maharaja here in the center with European guests at his friend Colonel Bindon Blood's house in Mussoorie. And this is really what you saw. You'd see these two styles, not much of a variation. But the Maharaja had already charted his own ideas and his own course in terms of his architectural legacy. He wasn't going to do what was common, what was typical, what was standard, conventional. He wanted to go with his own passions. And that was greatly influenced by what he saw in France. And in particular, we can see immediately that the Château drew inspiration from these chateaus of the Loire Valley. For example, Château de Loire was a chateau that the Maharaja spent a lot of time with his dear friend, the Princess de Blois. She was a French sugar heiress. She had the funds to restore this beautiful 17th century Renaissance chateau to perfection. So the Maharaja would spend weekends there coming down from Paris, and he really noted all of the details. And he wrote in his diary how beautiful this ancient chateau was. And he also absorbed all of the princess's, not only her decorating style and details, but also how she entertained so graciously. And we know that the Loire Valley is just dotted with many chateaus and beautiful buildings. And on the top, I'm showing you two more examples of Renaissance structures from the 17th century. Now, by coincidence, this was a style the Maharaja admired in France. This style had come back into fashion in the late 19th century. It was now the French Renaissance revival. So it was very fortunate for the Maharaja that not only this was a style he liked, but this was also now in vogue. And then on the far right, we see the Château Kapurthala. So when you look at all of these buildings, they may have been built centuries apart. They may have been continents apart, because this chateau on the left was built in America. But they all are part of the same architectural family, lots of striking similarities. So when we look at the Château Kapurthala, we can really see clearly that it's a foremost example of the French Renaissance style. And here are French Renaissance revival style. Here are some hallmarks. I mean, immediately you see it's obviously the turrets with the canonical roof. and then you have the steep pitched hip roof. You have this loggia with the arches and colonnade. We call, of course, the loggia a veranda in India. And then these dormers and central pediment on the roof, along with a grand central exterior staircase and balustrade. Another feature is that rustication, that heavy brickwork and the string course molding detail on that. You saw H.H. Richardson in America, for example, during the Renaissance revival in that country, used this stonework and masonry very frequently. Very little has been altered or changed since, as far as the exterior of the chateau since it opened in 1899. The Maharaja himself made some minor changes. For example, we see that on the left, there are no rear turrets on the chateau, when these were added by the Maharaja. This wasn't just for aesthetics, this also had a practical logic behind this, because these were the days before there was indoor plumbing. So on the balcony, you would have to leave your chamber pot out to be collected. And these rear staircases gave some privacy, and we were able to be a little bit more discreet about that. But other than that, we'll see that the exterior really has not been altered since it was first built. And this aerial view affords us a good look at this roof. And the roof is rather interesting because if this were a building in Europe or in America built during the Renaissance or the Renaissance revival, it would not be made of tin. It would probably be slate or another more traditional material. But here we are in the hills, and you get sleet, you get snow, you get rain of the monsoons. So you need a roof that is going to be sturdy, and that these elements, water will just pour off of it. And tin was a vernacular material used in the hills for the rain. And here it is put up on the chateau. It's a tin roof, which would have been atypical, wouldn't have been used in Europe or America, but it really lends itself nicely. And it's just sort of an adaptation that works with the local material. We see in French Renaissance architecture and in the Renaissance revival the use of griffins and mythological beasts and dragons. And here are my particular favorites. These are two stately winged lions that grace the top of the exterior staircase. And it's rather appropriate and rather clever to have these two lions, because the universal equalizing surname for all Sikhs is Singh, and Singh means lion. So these two stately lions guard the house of a Sikh ruler. So now we'll take a look inside. I'm sure you're eager to see what the interior looks like. We'll go right into the foyer, and we're greeted by yet another grand staircase. In the late 19th century, staircases weren't just a way to climb a floor. Staircases were built to make a statement. And this staircase, this double staircase certainly does that. It's very impressive. And as we have this image, there are a couple of things I want to point out. First, you can see that this oscillatory crystal chandelier is candlelit. The chateau wasn't electrified until 1912, which was pretty early for India. And you can also see this wallpaper. We'll see wallpaper in the vintage photos of the chateau. And owing to the dampness, it just did not last. So now we see it today. And again, no wallpaper. But really, you can see that it's very much extant. You can see some of the details on the woodwork and the central main door. The chateau was built to impress, and it was built for entertaining. Back in those days, you didn't come up to Mussoorie for a weekend the way people do now. You had to come up, spend a great deal of time there, maybe the season, a few months at least. It was very arduous to get up. And once you were there, the community would entertain. And this is the drawing room. And we can see, just as you showed us, Dr. Schmidt, from some of the earlier images, that it looks very old-fashioned and fussy right now, but this was the height of vogue when the Chateau opened. This is that very busy pattern Victorian look, and pattern and fabric and tassels and tufting. That all demonstrated that you had taste and you had money. These rooms were outfitted by Lazarus and Company, and that was a firm that was based in Calcutta, and they supplied furniture and interiors for the Viceroy, for many notable houses and palaces in India. If we look at the far end of the room, the focal point is this beautiful chimney piece, and it very much is in same style as the chimney pieces you would find maybe, but they were made of marble, at the chateaux in France and in the palazzos in Italy. And here's the room today. And you can see very little has changed, except for the wallpaper is not extant, but very little has changed in terms of the detail, the lighting. The furniture is all extant, but it looks so different because it doesn't have all of that embellishment. And then the window treatments aren't up. When we talk a little bit about preservation, we can talk about how this climate is extremely detrimental to silks and damasks and all of these fabrics. And then here's another beautiful chimney piece in the ballroom. Again, there was a ballroom, a billiards room, which we'll get to. It was all, these grand rooms were very much reception rooms. And I'm pointing out here something lovely to see, and that is the globe that the Maharaja studied on when he was a 12-year-old boy, when he just pored over that globe and desired to see the world. He absolutely loved geography and history, and he wrote that it was always his greatest desire to see the world and the confines beyond India. And of course he did eventually do that. He was one of the best traveled princes of his time. And he'd seen more of the world than I have. Now I mentioned that you were up in Mussoorie, you didn't go back and forth, and you needed entertainment. So most of these houses, you would find a billiard room. And this is the billiard room as it looked around 1900. And the Maharaja and his sons would spend many a rainy afternoon engrossed in an epic game of billiards. And here we see the room looking like a very period room with busy window treatments and wallpaper and fabric. This again is another room that was outfitted by Lazarus. And here we are today. And we're looking rather different because we don't have all that busy pattern work, but all of the furnishings and lighting are all extant from that time. When we talk about preservation and the challenges of a home in the hill, dampness and leakage tops the list. And this room, unfortunately, did suffer from a leak. And COVID has put all plans for restoration on hold. But thankfully, none of the furniture was damaged. And it still has this wonderful clubby atmosphere. Now I'm bringing up a sample board just so you can see some of the material used in the chateau. I'm showing the detail of the plaster of Paris molded ceiling. It's a very delicate material, but surprisingly, this has held up all these years in the principal rooms on the ground floor, except of course the ballroom. And another sample is of the Bombay tiling. The Maharaja had spent time in Bombay. He had visited some of the rich Parsi houses, as he wrote, and one thing he noticed is that he liked this tiling and wanted to have it involved in his own residence. And you'll see this in the chateau, in the villa, and in the Jagaji Palace. So again, it's another material that was rather indigenous that was incorporated. You also see a lot of tile work in the chateaus of France and places in Italy. Can everyone hear me all right? Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes, Mom.
Okay, just get a little paranoid about that. Thank you.
It's fine.
All right, we're going to move up to the upper floor, and here's a bedroom and a sitting room off of the bedroom. And you can see this is just as you were showing with the Elsa de Wolf furniture. This room is done in the French style, and we'll talk a little bit. I'll get back to the bane of enamel paint on furniture, because over the years it just becomes impossible to remove, it chips. But anyhow, I realized that when you look at these period rooms in these vintage black and white images, we can't get a sense of the richness that these rooms really were exemplified. They look a little dowdy in the black and white. So for example, I'm just going to bring up a color image of a room also from about this period. This is the Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island. And Maharaja Jagjit Singh actually visited this house in 1893, calling on Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt. It was a summer cottage in Newport. And the firm of Scalamandre was given some very faded treatment, faded material from the Preservation Society of Newport County. And they were able to recreate this from their archives. So now we can see this room, how it was, how it pops, how it's so vibrant and lush. And also the Maharaja had bought Aubusson carpets, which are now faded in time. But here we can really see how colorful these rugs were when they were new. The Château was the epicenter of social life in Mussoorie. There were constantly lunches. There were lunches, there were teas, there were dinners, banquets, balls, tennis and lawn parties. And here the dining table is set for an intimate lunch, just a mere 10 people. The dining room could be extended out to 50 people. About 50 people, okay. And we'll take a look at this room and note a few things. First of all, you can obviously see that there is the wallpaper up and extant, but the furniture was also throughout the house, and more Lazarus furniture. Lazarus sent an official up to Mussoorie, or rather a representative up. He took measurements for everything. So all the chimney pieces, all pieces such as the sideboard, they were all measured. So they really fit in seamlessly. And we can see on this table his love for France is reflected there. There's Limoges china, there is a baccarat crystal he placed in order. These are all bespoke pieces with the Kapurthala crest, as you can see on the chair. And there's still in this room right now that Victorian penchant for a lot of busyness. You see these mice and figures up on the side table, a lot of detail. And I'll go to that room as it looks in modern times. And the dramatic difference is you don't have that heavy wall treatment, but here you can see the details from the wainscoting and the over door pieces a little bit better. Really nothing has changed in this room aside from the wall treatment. And everything is extant because Brigadier has really taken such loving care of everything. I actually like it better without that busy detail, because you can see the lines of the furniture and of the woodwork a lot better. I'll also point out that this piece, you can see that broken pediment and finials, and then there's also some scroll work on it. That furniture style was the Renaissance revival furniture style as well. And then just some details of those pieces that are still extant. The Meissen figurines, the baccarat crystal, and this piece of crested Limoges. The Maharaja really took a lot of time, and it was enjoyable for him to go around to shops and selecting things, as we had seen as in Vienna. So he spent a great deal of time in Paris shopping, and it was very relaxing for him, and he had that beautiful taste. So what is unique is that he didn't just say furnish this house or build a house, an impressive house. He really was very hands-on with this property as he was with the Jagajit Palace and other buildings. He had always been very popular with the princes and the British, but upon the outbreak of World War II in 1939, he could no longer travel abroad, nor could his brother princes. So from the 1939 onwards, the interwar years, the Maharaja really ramped up the entertaining in Mussoorie. Mussoorie itself underwent a sort of a renaissance. There was, everyone convened there now, you couldn't go abroad. And on the top, you see a photo of him hosting a large garden party in honor of Princess Nilüfer of Hyderabad. There were probably about 100 guests with tables set out throughout the Château's lawn. And below, you have a visit. Nehru is called at the Château. This is just at the dawn of independence. And these two images really capture the Château in its heyday. The grand tradition after any of these functions was to all gather at the foot of the exterior staircase and have pose for posterity, have your photo taken. So throughout the years from 1900 onwards, you see this photo, but the people have changed, and of course so have the mode of dress. But this is probably dates from about the late 1940s, and really they're posed here after a grand celebration, and it's almost the twilight of these years, and Mussourie's years as this wonderful retreat are just creeping in, because once after independence rather, the British left, and the Indian princes, many of them had to sell their summer homes. They couldn't maintain multiple homes. So the social fabric of Mussoorie changed dramatically. You saw in that aftermath that Mussoorie went into a bit of a decline because of that. Many of these properties were abandoned or fell into disrepair. So a lot of heritage in that period, a lot of things were lost to a degree. But thankfully, as we are talking about resilience, the Château still stands very proudly, just as it did. Looking a little bit lonelier, but it is very much extant and unaltered.
Still a landmark.
And yeah. Now we're looking at a vintage postcard of Mussoorie, and you can see that the Château is a beacon of the landscape. It's still, it was a very important landmark of the hill station. You can also see the Savoy Hotel, and then, don't think you can see it clearly here, but also the Christ Church in Mussoorie. And in the 70s, there was a development initiative that very church was threatened. It was going to be pulled down, and thankfully some local activists halted that, because it's these properties and historic landmarks that really give that sense of placemaking, and as it does today. And here's the Château, that very same view. It's unaltered, and we can really see that this is one of the most notable landmarks to this day of Mussoorie. So it really strengthens the connection between the community, the sense of place, and that's why it's so important that property such as this and other historic heritage homes and landmarks are protected. So now with that, we probably wanted to turn to just talking a little bit about what the maintenance and preservation detriments are. And then I hope after we can just have some of the audience, maybe some of you who own historic homes might want to share in what you find are the biggest challenges. But you can really see, obviously, it's weather, rain, snow, dampness, old wiring, old plumbing, vegetation, growth, which can undermine the concrete.
Paints and varnish.
Paint and varnish. Yes, as we said, the white paint, you can't, it's painted and painted and painted, very difficult to strip.
The
And
working goes, you can't see the work on the woodwork.
And then landslides and earthquakes, and Mussoorie is on a fault line, and when was the last earthquake here?
That was about 1990.
Right, and that had caused some damage. So now I thought maybe we could all discuss what ideas some people might have in terms of collaborations, partnerships, ideas, and also in relation to the Center for Historic Houses. So with that, I'll just close my...
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I mean, that was really fascinating and really amazing to see all of this. But definitely, as far as the center is concerned, we would love to have a summer school, so something, a study program, once it's safe to travel, like the Attingham program. Of course, this is really wonderful. So we would like to have something like that in India. The Center for Historic Houses is already doing a summer school in Palermo with Indbau. And so we usually do this, during term time. But again, now we don't even know how the terms are structured and what the government will say about the regulations. So we really care very much about safety. A lot of people have encouraged me to do heritage excursions. That's something we have done before, because we did the Water and Heritage conference last year. And followed by an excursion, but it's simply not safe to travel right now. So we will not entertain any kind of travel at the moment. But otherwise, this is something which is really our ambition, to do that, to work with, also fellow curators, experts in the field, and study hill stations. And also particularly look at the kind of erstwhile royal families in hill stations. I really think this is a topic that hasn't been looked at. And also, we are looking at historic house museums. This is also something that hasn't really been examined in India. So this is something we would love to do with you. And I think the hill stations also, as far as the weather is concerned, would be wonderful in the summer.
Well, I think it's important to what you're doing. I mean, we're very keen that future generations, the millennials, who ultimately will be the custodians of this property, it's important that they all have this sense of history and heritage. And the more they know, that's my assisting.
And the keener they'll be to preserve it.
Yeah, and that's my role is to help document so that from there can be carried forward. And as you said, that it's really to create partnerships, to create have experts come to try to help what could be for example with leakages. I mean, we may not know, we know there's a leak. Where is it coming from? Is there an engineering, who's involved in engineering, architecture, who might be more of an...
It's a specialist domain. And that has to be explored for repair work.
Yes, so I mean, we certainly we focus on partnerships. That's very important for us. Both partnerships with owners of historic houses as well as with other heritage experts. So we do work with conservation specialists, both in India and abroad. And many of them are very keen to work in India as well, have already worked in India. So this is, wonderful to continue working with them. We also, work with the Oxford University Heritage Network, there is a number of very interesting new programs in the field of heritage management. For instance, at the Royal College of Agriculture in Cirencester in the UK. We are also looking at the study of tourism from an academic point of view with Greenwich University. Yes, Indbau, of course, is an international network. We are in constant touch with And there is also a group of INTBAU members in India. So we would love to introduce you, or establish such, introduce you to people like this. And of course, we also have our students at the center. Currently, we are doing research on objects, both for, Rashtrapati Bhavan. We also develop heritage interpretation schemes. And now we intend to enter a collaboration with Volio as well, which is really fascinating. And of course, we would love to actually work with curators and so on in Europe, because especially now when the topic of colonialism and so on is explored, which is very polarizing at the moment. But in India, it's a little bit different because the houses are being used and they have gained a different history. So how do we deal with this? And sometimes it's just real estate developers who want to demolish them, and and they just talk about colonialism in order to demolish them and replace them with the mediocre structures. So these are important topics. And I really feel, rather than pointing the finger, which I think is happening a lot in the UK now, which what you see with the National Trust and so on, we really want to create a future, of countries working together. This is something we did with Palace Day, because we are working with the European network of royal residences. And, so we want to create a future where the young generation is working together and is moving forward. Yes, we will research the past, the dark sides and the good sides, but in a complex way, and to create positive relations between the East and West. This is what we are trying to achieve.
Exactly. That's very, very admirable.
Very true.
We didn't know if anyone from the audience had any questions, especially I know to ask the Brigadier about the house or the history or his grandfather, but certainly.
Yes, I'm trying to find some questions. Yes, so Dennis Rodwell was a very loyal supporter. Thank you so much for being here. The chateau looks encircled by modern development.
Yes.
Yeah. And yes, and I would like to ask Cynthia, so I would love to know more about the objects and so on that are there, and also the kind of difference between Kapurthala, the villa you have there, the palace, and this is also, of course, another fascinating object, because there have been talks about opening the Kapurthala palace to the public, and apparently there is the plan for the school to move out of the palace, but I know it's kind of flip-flopping and going back and forth, and this is, of course, you being the descendant, would be lovely to.
He's the descendant. So we'll clarify that. He's the descendant. I just, I'm the.
Yes.
This topic has been under discussion for a long time, but I think what's going to happen eventually, excuse me, is that the Ministry of Defense is going to work out a system by which guided tours are taken around, because I don't see it being a standalone landmark for visitors, just to be able to take groups around and show them. No, it's being used for a very good purpose at the moment, but there will be an arrangement by which guided tours are taken around.
I've always lobbied for that even if it were to start out with one Sunday a month, I've made it very clear that I'd be happy to volunteer to do that, because when there are dignitaries, I have led the tour of the Jagajit Palace. And, I'm a firm believer that heritage belongs to everyone. And that's one of the reasons why it is unfortunate that at present with the defense, that it's very difficult for a member of the general public to get in to see the Jagajit Palace, because it is such a remarkable and beautiful building. It's so unique. And again, that's another completely other talk about the Jagajit Palace. But we're hoping, maybe with initiatives such as Palace Day and other things, and that will happen, because so many people are very curious. They want to learn about these buildings and they want to learn about Maharaja Jagajit Singh. So let's see what happens. Again, we're all waiting, because everything is on hold right now with the pandemic, but we can be optimistic.
Well, of course, we know from examples in England that it's never a good idea to have a school in a historic house. I mean, usually this leads to, the destruction of the building. But of course, to develop a comprehensive plan for the Jagajit Palace, this will take considerable planning and also interacting with the local population to see how it could best be utilized and used with respect for the building and the tradition. Yeah. And maybe, yes, if I can ask you about the collection and the interiors, given that Mussoorie is a summer palace and you're still using it as a summer palace, and then in October, late October, so you'll be going back to Kapurthala, right? This is how you normally do it. So how would you describe the atmosphere and the design and in these two different very different places?
No, at the moment, you see, the moment when we leave Mussoorie, we go back and stay at a place called the Villa. I showed you a photograph of that Italian style of building. That's where we're living now. It's on the banks of a little rivulet, and it has its own charm. And a lot of the contents inside are from the palace that have been moved there. So we don't stay at the palace anymore. No.
Yes, I know. I mean, I know, but you move between, I mean, Kapurthala and Mussoorie. I mean, you're going back.
Mussoorie, that is correct.
Yes,
correct.
yes. And, you know, for instance, I was interested in the library of the Maharaja, and you still keep it. So, I mean, is there an inventory or something like this? Or maybe, you know, because I know that the British Library, for instance, is having some very interesting digitization projects. Also, the University of Oxford is having a digitization of Indian cultural heritage project and has been working on this for several years. So are there any rare books, for instance, which could be digitized, or would you be interested in something like this?
Well, I think
a lot of the albums will be digitized. Photographs tend to deteriorate in this very steep weather conditions. But the rare books form part of the Kapurthala treasury, which were moved to the government of Punjab when the merger took place. And they are now in part of the Punjab archives.
these were from some of the local.
Those go back to Mughal days, the Mughal Atlas, for example, books on theology and astronomy, those sort of very rare books. Those are part of the Punjab archives now.
However,
is there an inventory of the Kapurthala library with the Punjab archives?
No, this is part of the Kapurthala archives, which have been merged with the Punjab archives.
You know, because I noticed often there is a lack of inventories. You know, I think even for the furniture at Rashtrapati Bhavan, there is no inventory. So I think it would be really interesting to know, you know, which, even although they have been merged, I think it is very important to know, you know, which books did he actually have and which books are.
I have an old inventory of what was handed over. Whether it's still there, I'm afraid I cannot check.
One thing that is interesting about the books that he does have from his grandfather's library is they really reflect that he had a diverse range of interests. You have books on architecture,
amazing interest.
Books on military, books on painting, really history.
Architecture, history.
He was extremely well read.
And did he actually write any comments in the books? Because I remember a friend of mine did a fascinating study on the library of Thomas Mann, and he actually used it to see what kind of comments he made and how these comments actually influenced the novels that he wrote. So are there any kind of comments?
Not that I recall. Most of his comments on events or on what he has read or heard or learned are reflected in his diaries.
Right. Thank you. And now our audience, is there any question you would like to ask? Otherwise, I would like to conclude the session so we stay within the time limit. Unless there is something, can just wait for a few minutes. Not right now. All right. So with this, thank you very much again. So I really, I'll be in touch. There is one message. Hold on there. I'll be in touch. Are visitors allowed? Someone is asking.
Well, this is a private home, and at least, well, under his custodianship, it's a private home. what the future custodians, that might be different, but that's why perhaps maybe next year, God willing, if we have some type of study day, or that could be,
we'd be happy. I'd be happy to receive your team here whenever you wish.
Thank you.
Whenever you wish, because it'd be a privilege to have you.
Thank you so much. And I'll be in touch. I'll also work on my side on a program for the summer program. And I hope that soon, we'll be able to travel again. And we'll be safe.
So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Very, very
and it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.